few more names to come in. Terrific. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Okay. So welcome to our session on thinking about.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Bailey. I'm the rights coach. And so I have just a few comments to introduce you. It won't take up long.
All right.
Are both of your presenters here?
Yes.
Okay. Well, once again, you're in the breakout session using stories and intentional conversations to build self-awareness and drive social change. We have two great speakers today, Gail Cruz Roberson, who is the co-director of the National SEED Project. She has worked in public education reform and adult education in New York City, Newark, and Chicago, my hometown, by the way. She is a hospice volunteer and is exploring new ways of working with the aging that incorporate the vision and strategy she's learned through her work with SEED. And we also have Sarah, am I saying your last name correctly? Fireman, like a fire. Okay, Fireman. She's a former principal, and she has written or contributed to many books on the subjects of school leadership, unconscious racial bias, and system-level improvement. She has taught in the school leadership program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she also earned her doctorate. So ladies, I turn over the session to you, and welcome to the participants.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you. We'd like to spend our time together thinking about how teachers can build their own self-awareness as a way to create spaces that are more engaging and equitable for everyone involved. And thinking about that, how does your own self-awareness and attention to your identity impact teaching, impact leading, and impact students' lives? So we want to think strategically about what we can do in the short term and in the long term. And we're coming from the position that data is useful, but data is not enough. And we also want to remind ourselves that data involves real people. Thinking about who we are in the educational process and who are we engaging with is a cornerstone of what we want to talk about. Sarah?
Thanks, Gail. Yeah, so one example, we just wanted to share some examples of why analyzing data, changing policies and practice, as Gail said, are important, but not sufficient. So I wonder if we could just get some different volunteers to read each of these examples. So would one person be willing to read one example of one of these very typical interactions that may happen throughout the day, one of many? Would one person just turn on their mic and read the first example?
I'll do it.
Thank you.
A white teacher says she's afraid to meet with a Black father for parent conferences because she feels unsafe. You want to read the whole page? You're on mute.
Thank you. No, how about we get another volunteer? Thank you, Veronica. Another volunteer to read the next one.
Students complain that a classmate's lunch from home smells funny, and the teacher encourages the Chinese American student to bring, quote, regular food to school from now on.
Somebody read the next.
A white student says she's going to wear a White Lives Matter t-shirt to school, and the teacher shrugs and mumbles something about freedom of speech.
The teacher tells the Latina student's parents that she's doing fine, even though the student rarely speaks in class and has handed in mostly incomplete assignments.
Thank you all for volunteering. So these are not made up examples. These are examples that either we witnessed ourselves or are very similar to ones that we witnessed or heard about ourselves. And we imagine that these don't feel atypical for you also. And so this again brings us to these questions of how do we prepare educators for personal, institutional, societal change towards social justice that are going to affect these interactions that happen throughout the day that are not always caught when we are analyzing achievement data, when we are changing policies and practices, both of which again are important, but may not be enough, we believe are not enough to catch all of these interactions that significantly affect students' experience in schools. So we believe that schools and districts need a strategy for how to address these countless interactions that happen, need a strategic long-term approach to build educator capacity. And so what we wanted to do with you is offer one sample activity that we might do, and this is in the work that Gail is leading with the National Seed Project and that I'm doing some work with and really learning a lot from Gail around. So one sample activity, and then we thought we'd do it together in an abbreviated form as a group, and then kind of unpack how that aligns with this long-term strategy that we want to offer. So first we thought we'd engage you in the activity. So we invited you to drop your name in the chat box. And probably most of us on this call know that one of the sort of most common and foundational ways that teachers often unintentionally cause harm to students is through the use of their name or the misuse of their name. So either mispronouncing, misspelling, trivializing, diminishing in some way, misunderstanding, or even making nicknames that aren't appropriate in all of these different ways. So we wanted to just do a simple activity with our group to unpack what is in our names. So we want to offer a number of questions and give you a chance to choose from some of them. Gail, I am wondering, am I going too far or am I explaining this part?
We were going to model and then we would offer them time to journal a bit.
Great. All right. So let's do modeling. We'll each model an example and then we'll offer these questions as invitations for you. Thank you, Gail.
Sure. So I'm going to start.
Sure.
So my name is Gail Ann Cruz Roberson. I go by Gail Cruz Roberson. My first name means happy. It was given to me by my mother, whose name was Gloria. And one of the reasons that she chose it, it's a short name. She chose it because our family is from the Caribbean. And oftentimes West Indian people have a tendency to create nicknames that are so entrenched that people never remember the first name of the people that they were born with. I can remember going to funerals and seeing for the first time a name that I never knew was connected to the person. So she was determined to find a name short enough that couldn't be shortened. And secondarily, she thought it'd be great because I could sign her credit card receipts when I got older. So she had a plan. But my last name is hyphenated because my birth name, family name was Cruz, and I chose to hyphenate Cruz Roberson. And for the last 33 years, I've wrestled with people trying to shorten it, trying to cut it off, asking questions about what my children will do when they get married, all of these things. So I've become very aware of how I value my name and how I need to fight for it in my day-to-day interactions. So that's me, Sarah.
So my name is Sarah Fireman, and my last name comes from my father, whose parents were Jewish and who came to this country when they were teenagers in order to escape the Holocaust. And their siblings who stayed behind, both my grandfathers and my grandmothers, were almost all killed in the concentration camps in Poland and Germany. And so my last name is a real reminder to me of my Eastern European Jewish heritage. It's spelled the way the immigration officer decided to spell it when my grandfather arrived at Ellis Island. And for my first name, my parents wanted something that represented both my Jewish heritage from my father and my Christian heritage from my mother. And so since Sarah is in both the Torah and the Bible, that's where my name Sarah came from. And that feels important to me also because it feels like it honors the heritage of both sides of my family. All right, so I want to just give you a kind of menu of questions that will invite you to reflect on your name. And we're going to give you more questions than you can possibly answer, with the idea that some of these may resonate more with some of you than with others. So tell us about your name, or actually, because we have limited time, we're going to invite you to journal, and then a few people will tell us about their name. So was it given to you by a family member? Was it a kind of random selection? Was there some premeditation? How has your name changed over time? Cultural aspects to your name, what are those? How does your name reflect your family's culture? Have you ever had to correct the spelling, pronunciation, and/or length of your name? Have you been given a nickname you didn't choose or didn't want? Have you ever had to choose whether to change your name? What was that like for you? In what ways has the reception of your name by others made you feel included? In what ways has the reception of your name by others made you feel alienated? Does anyone have a question about the activity we're inviting you to do? All right, people are going to it. We'll give you about 2 minutes. Can you just show me if you're ready? So kind of a thumbs up if you are ready. Oh, looks like people are still writing. All right, we'll give you the full 2 minutes. All right, that's our 2 minutes.
Thank you. So what we'd like to do, if we had more time, we would pair you up and have you share stories with each other in breakouts. But since we're in a group together, what we'd like to do is ask for a couple of people to volunteer to share up to a minute something about your name. Those of you who aren't able to speak to the group, we invite you to put in the chat something that one of the questions activated in you about either your name or what you understand about what it means for people's names to be either respected or disrespected. So we're asking for two different things. Volunteers to speak to the group about their name, some aspect of their name story, and those who would prefer to write in the chat something about the activity that was activated as a result of the questions. So if we could have one or two volunteers or two or three volunteers, I'll hold up my phone when a minute is up. If we could hear from you about your stories. When you're ready, you can just unmute and speak.
I can share.
Thanks, Scott.
So my last name, this might be family lore, but my last name supposedly means happy person in a poplar tree. I have no evidence to support that though. My first name, Scott, middle name is Gerald, which is my dad's name, which he does not like, goes by Jerry. I was named after the author F. Scott Fitzgerald. And my mother's never read F. Scott Fitzgerald. She just liked the name. So that's my story.
Thank you. A couple of other volunteers.
I'll go.
Thanks, Monica.
So I was named for my maternal grandmother, Veronica. My mother was all set to name me Anita Lynn, and her mother said to her, "Why don't you name her after me?" So I became Veronica Anita. I wasn't called Veronica though until I entered school, because at home people called me Ronnie. And you know, even now I'm called Ronnie by my family and a few friends. I think like Gail, I've had to fight for my full name to be recorded and recognized the way in my preferred style, the Anderson Thigpen. This is after I got married. I don't use a hyphen, but people want to put it in there. So it feels like a small thing to argue for. So, you know, it's not something I fight for all the time, but, you know, if it matters, that's what I want. And the only other thing I was going to say about the inclusion question was, for a while, I know this used to happen to me a lot when I started working as a young professional, calling and making phone calls, I would introduce myself and I would say Veronica Anderson, and people would always say Rhonda. So something between the way I would say Veronica, but people listening would hear Rhonda. So I had to make those corrections a lot too.
Thank you, Veronica. Couple more. Well, then let's move on to the questions that had to do with what happens, particularly with younger people, when a person in a position of authority misnames, minimizes, is flippant about a name. What does that do to the relationship between the learner and the teacher in those roles? And how does that impact a sense of people wanting to engage in a learning process together?
Well, it certainly doesn't foster trust or a feeling of inclusion. And, you know, I've seen many ways that can happen. with people taking it light or even making a comment sometimes, maybe genuinely interested or curious about someone's name who they may think is unusual, but it still can land in a way for the person whose name that is, either hurtfully or just feeling a little bit distancing. So it's not a good start for a relationship where you're trying to build trust and have an authentic teacher-student relationship.
Mhm. Mhm. And what was shared amongst us, there are family stories that are attached. So it's not just the person who's being impacted. It's casting a pall over the relationship that that person may have to their family. You know, there are stories that we've read of people who go to school, say for instance, with the name Patricia, and they come home as Patty. And they take years to get back to the name that their families gave them. And what does that do to someone in terms of trying to either fit in or resist? It can be an unplanned distraction to the learning process, certainly. It can seem small, but it's not. It builds on a variety of things that kind of build up over time. You know,
I work in a particular school district that has created as its tagline, know every student by name, strength, and need. And that kind of overshadows all of the work they do, from strategic planning, to professional development. And, it's combining the whole sense of name, but along with strength and need to open up opportunity to see the positives as well as the special needs of students. So I've really always been impressed with that.
Mhm. Mhm. When you think about how many families, particularly in schools that are challenged because of lack of resources, et cetera, are resistant to engaging with the school system for a variety of reasons, not least of which is a sense that their choices and their culture are not being respected. And names are huge in that regard. Not to mention, the example that we shared about food, family food prepared with love rejected. I mean, all of these things have bearings on how people are able to trust the people who are, in a position to make or break their education. Dawn, were you going to say something?
Yeah, a few years ago, our junior high interviewed, they just had a few very simple questions for students. And it was after their staff had gone through SEED training as a team. And they asked students about their names, and particularly what happens when teachers don't get your names right. And the students responded with not only how, in some cases, like you gave the example of Patricia and Patty, and how some teachers had said, oh, I'm never going to be able to pronounce that. Let me just call you Joe, or whatever it happened to be. We also have cases where a number of our Asian students, their families have given them a shorter name. And so, on the record, it's one name, and then just, you can call them Danny. So there's an interesting component there with our families who have sort of chosen to make it easier, perhaps, or in their perception, make it easier for their kid, with a difficult, a name that's difficult for those of us who don't speak that language to pronounce, certainly. And it was just really wonderful for the teachers to hear from the student voices why that is so important. Because, in some cases, the kids were they were really devastated about it, as they should be. And so just hearing the voices across, not only, students of color and from different cultures than mine, but a number of our white students too, who recall how it felt to hear their students, their friends' names being mispronounced and disrespected. So it was a great opportunity for us to learn from our kids.
Thank you for that. Yeah. There's also the alternate where you have, say, 3 different people named Emily. And so they start calling them 1, 2, and 3, or they cut the names off. It's not just names that are hard to pronounce. It's names that the teacher decides, oh, well, this is simpler for whom. So something to think about. anything else that the questions generated in your thinking about either your own name or your children's names or situations that you've been in where a name came into play that was pivotal in a relationship being built or destroyed?
Well, I think about transferring this not only to the students, but you think about the teacher interview process. You know, when a school district or a school is hiring, you know, individuals from diverse communities, and how the name either serves as an impediment or a certain application of characteristics that stops, you know, in the hiring process, you know, just cold blank, because they can't get past that to look once again at the individual strengths and you know, what they bring to the, you know, to the table uniquely, even besides, you know, degrees or specific credentials. So, I mean, that also to me are two places where this issue of name recognition and, you know, relationship around it, you know, play in our schools, in our districts.
Absolutely. You know, how many times do people get put on the rejection pile because of their names, because of either the difficulty of spelling or an assumption about their educational achievement? And if they change it and show up with a different name, things are different. Whose values are being lifted and whose are being set aside arbitrarily. So this is an activity that we do early on in a seed session, both as a way to create community, but also to help people think about how everything that we do has implications, which can be difficult to think, you know, think that thoroughly about things, but it's important for us to both think of the big picture of how we're going to strategically change institutions, but also not lose sight of how we show up in these institutions and how we interact both with our peers and with the learners in our settings. Because it's fairly certain to me that if I ask you if you could remember a classroom situation when you were, say, a young adolescent, that was pivotal. Maybe it was pleasant, more likely unpleasant, but I'm sure that you can remember how you were treated in those spaces. And it had less to do with the content and more to do with the relationship or lack thereof. And so if you start there, then you can become more strategic. So we start with the relational. We start with thinking about how we show up, what we bring to our work from our life experience, and then try to extend that so that we understand each other as well. And then by extension, understanding how systems work for, against, and in us. So each of us has our own unique identity, and that identity set, that combination of identities, is valued differently depending upon the settings that we're in. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how all of those dynamics work together, which can be challenging and it can be a lot to take in. But those things are working whether we acknowledge them or not. So we want to, you know, we try to shine a light on those aspects of who we are and the systems we're working in order to be more effective in them. So initially, as I said, experiential and relational learning is where we start by building community with each other in our settings. We meet regularly with people. We don't do, in SEED, we don't do like day-long seminars. We do monthly gatherings that are, when we're in person, 3 hours, combined with food, which enable people to relax and to be able to combine both what they know personally with what they've read or seen as a way to analyze and interact in a setting that is not, it doesn't pit people against each other. You're not asked to defend your position. You're asked to listen and to share. And by doing that, people build their relationships with each other, but they also begin to see ways in which they can make changes in their institutions with the support of other like-minded leaders.
Gail, can I add one thing to that?
Sure.
I was just going to say, I don't know if other people noticed it, but when Scott and Veronica volunteered, I felt like there was a slight shift in the group. Like when Veronica kind of took a breath and said, okay, I'll go. And, you know, it was sort of this willingness to, okay, I'm going to trust you all enough to tell a little bit of my story, and I'm going to take a risk and tell a little bit of this story. And if you can picture the impact of every one of us doing that, you know, that is such a big part of, if we're expecting transformation from folks, we need to build a container that is relational, where we have relationships with each other. So just one way that we do that is through something that can seem innocuous by sharing names, but then can build in risk taking over time.
Thanks, Sarah.
And so Gail mentioned those three things of experiential relational learning, investing in identity development. That's the second thing. And this is where we really believe that in order for students to support, in order for teachers to support students in developing their own sense of their identity, their feeling of pride and empowerment and identity, in order for principals to be able to support their teachers' sense of their identity, we as organizations, we need to be supporting our staff in their own identity development. And that's around multiplicity of identities. So we know, as scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, oh, and I forgot to put the accent over her E, but as she wrote about this idea of intersectionality, there's no such thing as all women or all Black people. We all have a unique constellation of identities. And in these monthly meetings, we're really inviting people to explore their identities. We know that most white people have not had a lot of experience exploring their white racial identity, and that is so critical to understanding their impact on students. And there are lots of people of color who also haven't had as much experience exploring their own identities, and then all the other various identities that we hold. So this is a big part of the work, is investing in identity development. So explicitly having a strategy for how we support educators in identity development.
So thirdly, in concert with understanding our own identities, we supplement the work with either readings or movies, film, other people's writing around systems, understanding systems and how they function around us. Part of that is history, part of it is in the here and now. And so it's important for us to think about how each of us are either lifted up or held down by various systems, and to understand that we might be at a disadvantage for one of our identities, but at an advantage for others. So it's not just intersectional, but it's very dynamic in terms of understanding how systems can either reinforce or deny people access. So thinking about our race, class, religion, ability, age, sexuality, and gender, all of those come into play in each of us in very different ways. And it's important to remember that. So the purpose of all of that ultimately is to look at what institutions, the educational institutions, are doing to either reinforce or challenge those systems. And the last question that we have there has to do with, what are we doing either passively or actively that might be colluding with systems that are oppressing some people and lifting others up arbitrarily? None of those are easy questions to ask, and they are shifting, they're changing all the time. But we take the time to look at those because they are a source of both information and knowledge. So knowledge is power. Once you understand what you're working with, you can begin to make changes. And the goal of all of the work that we do, beyond having conversations that build community, is getting people to the point where they can act on what they now understand. So the goal is change. The goal is enactable possibilities. And we are at 3:31, so I think we probably need to take the time to give people a chance to maybe ask questions or react before they make us disappear.
Yeah, although, I think we're going until 3:38. I think,
Oh.
does anyone know?
There's
When I saw
6
the-
minutes and 33 seconds left in the breakouts.
Thank you, Peter. Neil, I realized before you speak to the seed, I realized I left an important connection to rides out when I was talking about identity development.
Yes.
And that is that we had the great opportunity, Gail and I had the great opportunity this year to be invited to work with a district that's working with rides. And what brought them to us was they had done a self-assessment around the rides rubric and had identified self-awareness and cultural proficiency as two areas where they needed to grow. And they wanted to strategically plan for how are we going to build self-awareness and cultural proficiency. And so they invited us to come in and do this work first with their principals. And then the goal was to get some of their teachers trained through SEED to then return to the district and have those teachers work with their colleagues. But the principals and district administrators wanted to get some foundational understanding first before the work with the teachers was happening. So this was to specifically address those two components of the rides rubric, although of course that kind of self-awareness and understanding of systems is throughout that rubric, not just in those two areas. Back to you, Gail, to close us out here, and then I guess we can see if there are questions.
Well, all I want to say is that if you're interested in more information about how SEED does its work, the website is www.nationalseedproject.org. But you can see that Sarah's described pretty much what is what has been done with Athol and how we operate on a regular basis. So if there are any questions with the time that we have remaining, let's go to that space and see if there is anything.
I would just offer too that we've been a SEED district for, I think this is year 6. And we'll be adding 3 new trainers to our arsenal this summer. And so I think we're up to a total of 12 trainers now in district. So if folks want to hear about sort of how we've embedded it, it's also a part of our collective bargaining agreement as well, that staff are SEED trained, and we're working on developing our second SEED seminar right now. So if folks want to hear about it also like down the road, not just initially, you can feel free to reach out to me. I'll throw my email in the chat.
John. I guess before folks ask another question, I just wanted to say, so Gail and I are talking about experiences that we've had leading SEED, and Gail obviously as one of the co-directors of SEED. But a larger question for everyone is, how are you very intentionally planning for building the capacity of all of your staff around identity development, around understanding how systems of oppression work, in order to address those scenarios that we shared at the beginning, which may not be addressed through data analysis and policy change alone. So what is your strategy for developing that capacity? And then I'll return to if folks had questions.
I'd be interested in hearing what the strategies are for developing that capacity at a system level. And then also for Gail, just can you just give a little snapshot about how SEED works with districts, public school districts?
Sure. Well, initially we had teachers who would come from a school and go back to their school and start working with a group of 10 to 20 people. But as Dawn alluded to, her district has been working with SEED for a period of time, and it's been somewhat evolutionary in terms of having that first group, but then in year 2, increasing the number of people who either were trained or were willing to participate. The group that we worked with this past year, and we're not quite finished with them, it was a group that we'd never done before as SEED. It was a group of administrators in a public school district across the district who decided they wanted an experience for themselves, which from a power perspective was amazing, but it's also rare because oftentimes we've had administrators come and be trained, but then they're not in a position to lead the kind of sensitive sharing that their staff want to do, even though they think they're willing. You know, there's a power differential. And if people start talking about things that are personal to them with their supervisor in the room, it can be a little awkward, potentially, career affecting. So we were able to have a group of all administrators who did their own work together as a team. And now, like Dawn's district, they're sending teachers to be trained this summer, who will then take it to teachers, and hopefully eventually they'll have parents and other faculty people as well as community members. But it's a multi-year process. It doesn't happen all at once because it's a complete, I should have mentioned this at the outset, it's a voluntary process. We don't mandate it, because you know what happens when you mandate programming. So people volunteer to be in it, but we have an understanding that although we're working with the choir, so to speak, the choir is in relationship with the skeptics. And if they are able to make changes in their classrooms that draw attention, the skeptics want to know what's going on and why you're getting different results with this student I've never been able to communicate with before. So that's some of how it works.
Thank you. It's like we're almost out of time, but that was what I was interested in, whether you worked just with teachers or if you worked with administrative teams or superintendents and school boards.
Yeah, yes to all of the above. We've evolved in that way. We started with teachers, but more recently in the current climate, everybody is very much on board and trying to